Hello and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Forensic Psychology. Today and in this episode we wanted to talk to you about the Power Threat Meaning Framework, or PTMF for short, which is an alternative model to the diagnostic model of thinking about distress, complex behaviours or troubling behaviours. We're really privileged today to be joined by Dr. Jo Ramsden, who is a consultant clinical psychologist who currently works in the offender personality disorder pathway. Jo is a clinical lead for a cluster of services in Yorkshire and Humberside. She's an expert and has particular clinical interest in new ways of working with what might be termed as personality disorders, particularly in ways which are organisationally focused and trauma-informed. So Jo, thank you so much for being able to join us this morning and for taking the time out to be with us.
Pleasure.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are today?
I guess the career journey was one where after qualifying, I worked in forensic mental health settings. So I worked in a low secure unit, and then I worked in a medium secure unit. I guess really struggled with both of those. I think probably really struggled with both the settings because of the I don't want to be too kind of like critical of psychiatry colleagues, but I found the model, I suppose I found the very medical model in those settings really problematic, so it was a real breath of fresh air for me to leave in 2008 and start working for Leeds Personality Disorder Services, so in the community, which I really love, and in a service that is psychologically led. So I think what that brings with it is a bit of a freedom, really, to maybe use some of the ideas that we're going to be talking about today, and I guess probably an opportunity to see the benefit of that as well. So in Leeds Personality Disorder Services, I've worked in various parts of that because it's a kind of big service, and most recently I work on, as you said, with a cluster of OPD commissioned services. Everybody will know what OPD means. Is that a
useful to explain it? Yeah, we have talked about it before, but it's useful to explain it.
Okay, so that's the National Offender Personality Disorder strategy. So I work with alongside or in partnership with probation colleagues to enhance the case management of high risk offenders who potentially hit the markers for a personality disorder diagnosis, although as a lot of people will know, that you don't require a diagnosis to be on the pathway. So in that respect, it's quite radical, I think.
Sounds really interesting, Jo. And can you tell, what does a day in the life of Jo look like?
I knew you were going to ask me that, and I was sort of joking about it with my family, because at the moment my day looks like getting up, going for a walk or a run, and then sitting at my kitchen table until I stand up and make tea. That's what my day looks like at the moment. So it's I know it's the same for everybody, isn't it? I guess I'm in a normal time. I'm really lucky that it's a very varied job, so which I really love. So I guess it's a bit of supervision, it's a bit of teaching, it's a lot of meetings, unfortunately, but I really enjoy the partnership work. I really enjoy working with probation, and I find that a really sort of creative, inspirational kind of like way of working. So yeah, it's lots of meetings with probation colleagues and talking about cases. I've forgotten, what is it like? What did it used to be like?
The world gone by. What's happened?
Yeah, the world gone by. Yeah, I'd go to places. That's what I do.
So could you tell us a bit more about what the Power Threat Meaning Framework is, what that means?
So it's a framework that's really about making distress meaningful. So really understanding like why I guess mainly the interpersonal kind of and power, interpersonal stresses and power abuses that have happened in somebody's life, which means that they present with a range of upsetting, troubling, difficult experiences that we typically understand within a diagnostic framework. I think for me, the other thing about the PTMF is about trying to radically shift things, because coming from somebody who works in a psychologically led service, and for anybody who practices as a psychologist, you've got a sense that people do things for really good reasons. I think we do that, don't we, naturally, So that's what we bring to our work, and we bring that all the time. But I think what the PTMF is trying to do but we tend to do that within a framework of diagnosis. Do you know what I mean? So all of us are working in this kind of like, there's around us, there is I suppose a really dominant narrative and a dominant framework that is medicalised, and we do our meaning-based work kind of within that. And actually what the PTMF is trying to do is sort of radically shift that, so there is a proper alternative for people. And there are, I mean, when you think about what that means, that's really profound, I think. So so I was at a meeting recently where we were talking about I'm part of like our trust's ethical, I'm part of an ethics committee that's been set up as part of the pandemic. And we were talking about some of the ethical problems with prescribing sodium valproate for women who've got of childbearing age who have been diagnosed with bipolar. And we were talking, and what I was sort of saying in that meeting is, are they given an alternative? So, and I think it kind of blows people's minds, this idea that actually what you might be doing is saying to somebody, not just the problems with sodium valproate or contraception to make sure that you know you're not going to get pregnant while you're on it and all of that, which is the stuff that gets tussled with, but actually, has somebody thought about the fact that this problem that they are seen to have might actually make sense? You might actually be able to talk to them about something that's happened to them. You might be able to create a narrative around that problem, which helps them situate it, understand it, forgive themselves, have compassion for themselves, start to explore alternative ways of managing it or thinking about it. And it's kind of, does that make sense? It's mind-blowing, I think. And I think that's what the PTMF is trying to do, is like a real radical shift in our understanding why people suffer.
Do you have a way of like when you're working with somebody, do you have like a really simple way of describing it to them that would be helpful to share here?
So we don't talk about the PTMF in the work that we do. It's that the work that we do is kind of informed by it, but we don't talk about it explicitly. But what we do talk about it with people is that, so the PTMF has got 4 questions, and which you may be aware of, which is to do with what's happened to you, rather than what's wrong with you. That's one of the central ones. How has power operated in your life? What meaning did that bring for you? What was the meaning that was attached to that for you? So it's and then it's about threats. Like what are your threat responses to that meaning? You don't use those questions in a very sort of crude way. You wouldn't sit down with somebody and say, right, what's happened to you? Because you can imagine that's immediately potentially triggering of trauma, really disorientating, shaming, very difficult for all sorts of reasons. But it is about using those questions to kind of inform how you talk to somebody. So I guess all the work that we do is it comes from a place of like that people do things for really good reasons. So for example, with the work that I do, people are screened onto this pathway. They're sort of identified then that they have this thing called a personality disorder. Don't know what that means. So we go to great lengths to talk to them about the fact that we understand that to be a response, that a really understandable human response to the things that they've experienced, and that anybody who was in their position when they suffered, or when they were children and when they were growing up with a lot of adverse childhood events, they would have ended up in sort of in a similar situation, because those threat responses are really human, and really really intelligible. So it's about understanding distress as being a threat response to trauma and to the misuse of power. For me, one of the really important things about it is power. I don't think we talk enough about power, and I don't think that's in our training very strongly. So what we've done in the work that we do is we talk much more since the work sort of being involved with the PTMF. We're a lot more informed about power. We talk a lot more about that, and about social injustice.
And I was just curious, Jo, you were saying earlier, and as you were talking, some of the problems with just the diagnostic model, and while acknowledging there's utility for it and there's a place for diagnosis, And I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about, so what has your experience been of some of the difficulties if we only focus on diagnosis?
Certainly in the work that I do with people who get a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, I mean, you'll be aware that that's just a description of things that people do. It doesn't tell you anything about why or what the experience is like internally as a human being. So so there is something about the fact that it's just really limited in terms of human experience, I think. So it brings with it, I think, a way of thinking about yourself that is really limited, doesn't really take you anywhere, and is it's an error, isn't it? You end up sort of thinking there's something wrong with you, something wrong with your brain, which isn't true. So I think for me, it's mainly the limiting nature of it, really. But that's not to dismiss the fact that for some people it's really, really helpful. And when we've worked with service users, people who use our services, when we've talked to them about the diagnosis, they're very clear that it's, for a lot of them it has actually been really useful, mainly because it opens doors, and because sometimes I think people feel hope when they think there's something wrong with them that could be fixed. Then it gives them, then they feel hopeful. And that's, I think, one of the problems that we have with a sort of more narrative, meaning-based kind of understanding of distress is that I worry sometimes that for people they can sort of then think, well, what do I do then? Because where am I trying to get to? And that I worry that could feel hopeless for some people. So I do think that the diagnosis is helpful in that respect. So yeah, I don't want to dismiss anybody's experience of it being helpful. But I mean, what the authors of the PTMF talk about is it's an alternative. So it's about giving choice. So it's about people having, if this doesn't fit for me, if this doesn't help me, if this doesn't work for me, this diagnosis that I've been given, then there's another way of thinking, and that might be really enlightening. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. I was thinking what you're saying about people. Some people like a diagnosis because it feels like someone else has got the symptoms they have and it makes sense to them. But I suppose it's about how that then limits them. Often we find that people get more limited by the diagnosis than freed by it. So I suppose this sort of thing where we think, well, actually, if those things have happened, that's a natural response to those things happening to you. So it feels much more sort of trauma informed and much more going alongside them rather than saying, well, you've got that because you've got this list of symptoms, so that makes you in that category. It seems to be much more empathic towards the reasons people have got it. And I think as a psychologist, as you said, we always want to know, well, that was my sort of drive of being a psychologist, why people do what they do. So I guess this explains that, doesn't it?
There's also the fact that it's, in the work that we do in forensic settings as well, it's whether it compounds risk. So if we understand risk as being a threat response, then potentially, if we're not really attending to somebody's meaning, to what their sort of world looks like and what the relational world looks like in particular, then I think we have the potential to trigger trauma and sort of compound suffering, really. And then what we're compounding then is the threats, and leading to increased threat responses, which are likely to be risky. One of the examples I talk about is a guy who came onto our one of our therapy groups, and he had received an indeterminate public protection sentence for non-violent offences. So it was mainly for like a massively long career of robbery, really. And but he got an IPP sentence, went into prison, and then really struggled and talked really openly about the fact that the sentence felt like a millstone around his neck that he couldn't shake. So every time he went into the community, every time he was released, he was thinking, I'm just going to get sent back anyway. I can't do it. Everybody's watching me. They want to send me back. And he would be using drugs, and he'd be struggling, and he would end up going back to prison. And then when he was in prison, what he was seeing was people, because the IPP sentence had been abolished by then, he was then seeing people coming into prison on lesser sentences or determinate sentences for what looked like worse crimes for him. So he became increasingly frustrated and increasingly kind of, angry at the system, and then became a violent offender. So without understanding that, he smashed his cell up once when his parole, he was turned down for parole. So it's this kind of sense of like, we need to understand somebody's world if we're going to help them not be risky. It's, you know, this is about, in criminal justice settings, I think the PTMF has to be relevant to risk. We have to be able to use it to talk about risk, and the best way to understand risk, I think, is to really understand somebody's world as best we can.
One of the other things I was thinking about the model is it seems to really lend itself well to thinking really systemically about why someone might present in the way they do. So, like, you know, you're talking about the trauma-informed ways of working with someone. And I often think one of the criticisms I think sometimes of forensic psychology models historically has been it's the behaviours focused within the individual without thinking about the context in which some of the behaviours occur, and without understanding and the function behind some of the behaviours. Whereas the PTMF sounds really formulation based and really try to understand why. And I think that opens it out to think, well, actually, you know, there are only certain situations in which someone might commit an offence, and what are they and what might they be? How can we help that person understand their behaviour rather than pathologizing perhaps an angry response? Let's understand it and put other measures in place to help them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the I think how it tends to get used in a lot of forensic settings is with the team formulations. So you'll get a group around a PTMF formulation to help understand somebody. And for me, what I'm particularly interested in is our organisational threats. So how we respond as workers and as services and organisations in our own threat response to people. So which means that we then compound their trauma. So our own anxieties, our own you know, feeling overwhelmed or hopeless ourselves, or afraid ourselves, and then the things that we do. So we may, you know, respond dismissively or punitively, or however, you know, whatever that means, and in a way that actually sort of like then compounds things. One of my first messages about using the PTMF in forensic settings is about first applying it to yourself. So really thinking with yourself and your team about, like, what threat responses have I got to this person? How am I responding to them in a way that might be unhelpful?
Oh, I love that. That's brilliant. It's a really good idea for like supervisors, isn't it? That's fantastic.
Because I was thinking we sort of did this in our time during the pandemic, and how we were responding, certainly in the first lockdown when everybody was so fearful, and trying to manage our own fears and anxieties and not project those onto the residents, but who also had massive fears and anxieties. So I was wondering now, because we're just starting to come out of it, and that's really interesting as an organisational way of using it, is how we start to think about, you know, how do we somehow shake off our feelings from the last year and move forward without we're not saying we'll pretend they're not there. It's sort of finding how do we move forward positively.
It's the bit that's missing, I think, from a trauma-informed approach, is the fact that, you know, the organisations are quite often traumatised and disordered, whatever that means, themselves. So it's so we really have to, a truly trauma-informed approach has to start with us, I think.
What's been your experience of using that within the organisation and like with staff members?
Well, I think that's really mixed, because it does, I think it probably takes a level of emotional resilience to be able to think about that, to be able to think of yourself as being a you know, somebody who responds emotionally to the work. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's professional, isn't it, not to? So it's so for me, it comes down to leadership, really, and about us leading services and systems where it's okay to say that you're struggling. So we've got in our service, we have a way of having case discussion, which is based on the Balint group model. Don't know if you've heard of that, where you have somebody who will talk about the case, and then you have a little group of consultants who are thinking about the question and whatever it is that person needs, and then you've got observers. It's really, actually, this is one of the good things about the pandemic and doing it online, because people can turn their cameras off. So the observers turn their cameras off so they can just watch what's going on the screen, and then the consultants turn their cameras off and they watch the observers talking about their discussion. The purpose of it is so that we can notice ourselves, really. So we can sort of notice, you know, if you were lapsing into like language that was a bit punitive, or you were starting to like, I don't know, like the energy was a bit, you know, people were hopeless or just focused on somebody's risk and not really on their, you know, what happened to them, all of those things. So the purpose of the the structure is so that we can notice the things that we might start to do that are unhelpful and that are probably about our own threat responses rather than being really focused on what that service user needs.
I was thinking, as you were talking there, I wondered if that sort of framework sits quite nicely sometimes with thinking about transference and counter-transference. I don't know if that's where that kind of model comes from, Joe, but I was really thinking about that when you were talking about how your organisation might think reflectively about someone you work with.
It's probably another way of thinking about something similar, isn't it? But I suppose the sort of the shift is less about a pathology within that person that's making you respond in that way, to it being about this is our problem.
And do you have any experiences of using the PTMF directly with clients, and how has that gone? How have they responded?
What we do is we have in our service we have a clinical model which states sort of explicitly that we understand the problems that people who we work with come from adverse childhood events, that they are and usually that will involve the misuse of power. So this is all explicit in our clinical model. And the reason we do that is because we almost want to be able to sort of I think what happens quite a lot of the time in formulations, when we do formulations, is we're trying to make a case for the fact that somebody's been traumatized. To be truly trauma informed, we're going to say that it's a given that everybody who comes through our door, so to speak, is has been subjected to interpersonal power abuses or traumas or adverse childhood events, however you want to call it. And we're going to just take that as read, that that's happened. And from there, we will go into like, what does that mean specifically for that person? Then what does your, how do we understand what that means for you as an individual? So that's where the formulation part comes in, because what we want to do then is have a very kind of like quick workable formulation about that's what that means for this person, so that everybody can use it. That's the goal anyway. So we have the clinical model, which is very PTMF informed, talks about power, talks about threat responses. And then we have a formulation framework, which again sort of guides people to think about like what the meaning is for that person. And then further down, like, we assume that this person's been disempowered, so how can we then work to empower them? We did an example recently where we've had some new starters, and the formulation framework that I've just been talking about, they were new to it. So we did a live consultation again via Zoom, where I took them through it. I had it on my screen and I was typing into it. And one of my colleagues role played a probation officer or offender manager, and she was bringing a case and she was talking it through. And the case was a guy who she was really struggling with, because it was a real case, somebody who an offender manager had brought to her. The offender manager struggled with him because he'd come out of prison and he'd been repeatedly released from prison but then recalled. And he was every time he came out, she was like, I've got to talk to him about risk management, and he just won't. So the offender manager was there with this kind of like, I need to talk to him about, how are we going to stop things going wrong, basically. And he wanted to talk about the fact that his fridge was broken, or, he ran out of credit on his phone, or he couldn't get the bus, or there was his council tax, or I don't know, anything that was kind of like really just felt like stuff that she was sort of thinking, this isn't what I can help you with. I can help you with something so much more important. So she was really frustrated. And alongside that, as she knew he would descend into drug use, so she was feeling powerless to stop him being sent back to prison, because she knew he'd start using drugs, and she couldn't talk to him about the things that felt important. So we had a long conversation about using our framework, about the fact that what we needed to understand was what he was managing in that room. So for him, managing the threat that she posed as as somebody who has been traumatized by other human beings, being in that room with somebody wanting to talk to him about something would have felt really threatening. And actually a good way to manage that would be to control the conversation by not talking about anything she wanted to talk about, so he could get out of there. And we really used it to think not really about drug use, which is what you could easily lapse into thinking, like, this is about his risk is all around drugs, but to think about the fact that he was moment to moment managing just turmoil and just threats everywhere in the interpersonal world, and being in the community, being in an approved premise, or just being outside of prison must have felt overwhelming and frightening and just awful. And actually drug use was a really good way of managing that, just descending into a fog of like, you know, not having to worry about it. So we talked about, because what was happening with him was there was starting to be a sense that we're just going to have to tolerate his drug use. To keep him in the community, we're going to have to tolerate his drug use. And actually what was probably important to understand was that drug use was a massive way of a threat response to help him cope. And that what he probably needed was to go back to prison, get clean, and to use that opportunity to really talk to him about what the community is like and just how stressful it is and how difficult to have it. And to, you know, a realistic risk management strategy for him wasn't to just release him and then start talking about his risk, but was to really plan for how he could be contained and feel safe in the community. That's what needed to happen.
We see that quite a lot, don't we, in terms of people who've bounced in and out of prison all the time and might not necessarily have the right support or the right resources to be able to navigate the challenges in the community very well.
Yeah, exactly. And what was missing from his risk, from all the thinking about the risk management, was what he's coping with, like how he feels. You know, it was just you know, you could sort of see from what she was bringing that this guy was probably terrified all the time, and that was missing from the thinking about him, because he was difficult and annoying, and he kept, you know, doing the things that everybody said to him just don't do. For us, the PTMF is about just really trying to get into somebody's world, really, and the meaning of their experience.
At the beginning, you said about the PTMF being quite radical, and I understand that, you know, when it came out, it was very new. But when we're talking about it now, you're just talking about it as understanding someone's world. It shouldn't be that radical, should it?
No, it shouldn't. It shouldn't. But and this is where I suppose I'm sort of interested in the organisational stuff, because it makes loads of sense. And I think you were asking me earlier about what's been my experience of using it with staff. And I talked about leadership, which I do think is really important. There is, I think, probably when I worked on wards, whenever you brought a meaning-based kind of understanding of somebody, people would kind of go, "Oh, yeah, that makes sense." And it was always, you know, really useful for people. But I think we have to be thinking about organisations to be able to help us think about why we lose that, really. So if it makes sense and it feels intuitive and it works, then there are things that happen which make us stop doing that. You know, so this guy, we stop thinking about the fact that he's terrified, and we start thinking about the fact that he's annoying, and we go from a place of sort of like potentially kind of, you know, sitting in a room doing a formulation, we could think about him quite compassionately and sort of really in a way that's really sort of meaning based. And then when you're in a room with him, you'll probably just be like, for God's sake, just let's talk about the fact, don't use drugs, you know. So it's that bit where we lose it. And I think that's where we have to be really aware of our own stuff that comes in then, to help us manage that. You might want to then have a conversation about, like, you know, look, this is what happens between us because you're struggling so much. I find it really hard then to be able to talk to you about what that's like for you. I forget, and I lose it because we've got two different agendas, and you know, I want you to know that I understand that. So what can we do so that I can talk to you better? Those sort of conversations.
And I think that's often when we talk about organisations, we've got different agendas. So we, you know, a psychologist might have one agenda, the prison officers we work with might have a different agenda, and the government might have a different agenda. And I think that's really important. And we often find if somebody is behaving in a way that's causing concern, and we say, well, you know, if I was feeling like that, I'd probably react in the same way. People do get alongside them and empathise. And I guess it's the same thing with the organisation. If we say, well, no wonder people feel under threat, and remind everybody this is why we're all reacting in this way. I could see, really useful to, hadn't we have thought about it I mean, you think about it a lot in trauma-informed approach, but I hadn't thought about it with the power threat meaning framework.
Yeah, I've always sort of said this will be useless unless you make it relevant to risk.
Mm.
You know, if you're in a MAPA panel or something, you could be talking about the PTMF and people would be like, that's really interesting. You know, really enjoyed thinking about it, but how does it help us? And how does it help us not have more victims, essentially, and, you know, protect the public? So we have to be able to make it relevant to risk. And I think the work that needs to happen more and more is to show how we use it to formulate risk and how we use it to make really robust recommendations about risk management. There's one guy who I've talked about so much, and I've written about him as well, which is a guy who was really, really angry, and the paper that I wrote about him was one where he'd come and he'd needed his bus fare refunding, which I told him he could do, that was fine. But when he turned up and asked for his bus fare to be refunded, and I said that I just need his bus ticket to do that, he got really, really angry and said, "Are you calling me a liar?" And so that was the title of the paper, because it was suddenly like kind of like really like, you know, it went from like a really reasonable situation to something that was immediately like really adversarial. I was furious, he was furious, it just completely broke down. It was really difficult. And this was the thing that plagued his risk management. So he was on a life sentence, and he'd been released before and gone AWOL for a couple of years, I think. And he was and his life sentence was for murder as well. And what he sort of came with was this reputation, because he was so difficult and he was so angry. But actually what we were able to do, I think probably through using the PTMF, was really to help understand where a lot of his anger came from. So he had been profoundly disbelieved as a child about the abuse he was suffering. And he'd raised the alarm quite a lot, and he'd been disbelieved. And, you know, so then repeatedly exposed to this horrendously abusive environment at home. And so this is what he walked around with, was this sense that people would sort of disbelieve him, humiliate him, just not be on his side, I guess, but really this thing about being disbelieved. So it was really helpful to think with his offender manager about the actual risk factors, which were quite low. By that time he was a lot older. He physically wasn't brilliant. He was no longer drinking like he had been when he committed his index offence. So there were a lot of things that were sort of he was really isolated as well, and things changed in terms of risk factors, but he was still really angry, and his anger was getting conflated with his risk. But actually through the work that we did, we sort of helped her think about this as being a threat response that might not necessarily be related to risk. So he got reclassified as being medium risk rather than high risk. And what came out of that was some really fruitful conversations, because he pushed everybody away. It was really, managing him was really difficult. But actually what we could do is we could start to talk to him about like the meaning behind his anger, how disorientating it was for me. You know, I was able to sort of, after this thing with the bus ticket, I had to go away and calm down because it was so difficult. And then when I saw him again, the conversation I could have with him was like, look, I'm really sorry that I responded like that, but it genuinely, it's not that I thought you were lying. It's weird that you thought I did. So where does that come from? And then we could talk about the fact that it was directly related to the experiences he'd had as a child, which for him resonated and made a lot of sense. And he started to then be able to kind of say, it's to own some of it, really. So he'd be able to talk about the fact that he had to, that he mistrusted everybody, and what it would mean for him to be able to trust people, and how vulnerable he would feel if he did that. So we started to be able to have those really fruitful conversations with him, and his offender manager could as well. The crucial thing was that his anger was getting really conflated with risk. So he was being, that was the thing that he sort of needed, I guess we needed to be able to do, was to think about, what is this about, and is it relevant to his risk management? And of course it's not irrelevant, obviously, but it's something that can be worked on and thought about, maybe slightly separate to some of the the things that might make us worry about him killing somebody again.
I was also thinking about how that may have been misunderstood perhaps as an anti-authority attitude.
Yeah.
You know, thinking about some of the risk factors, if you like, and actually how that could be easily perceived as someone who's just anti-authority and not following what he should be doing, and very mistrustful. We're actually not really understanding actually there's a lot more behind it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then you could, you know, one of the things he'd talk about is that everybody's a threat. I can't get on the bus, you know, the bus driver's a threat. So it's absolutely that. It is not, it's not necessarily authority. It's everyone, it's people. So one of the things about having a paradigm shift, I guess, or a really radical change in thinking, is it links distress to social injustice and to society, really, and to the potential for social action. It's like, if we're going to work differently with people, we need to be tackling the ACEs. You know, we don't want to just be dealing with people when they show up at our services, or when they, you know, present at A&E having self-harmed, or when they, you know, in our case, when they've killed somebody. We want to be thinking about the, you know, the stuff that makes people poor and isolated and abused and lonely and stigmatized and, you know, excluded, and all of those things. It's just this is what makes people distressed and dangerous.
And the final question, do you have any future plans or any aspirations?
One of our short-term aspirations is to have a peer support worker in our service. That sounds so basic, doesn't it? But like, involving somebody with an offending history is really problematic, as I'm sure you know. We're in the process at the moment of writing a job description and trying to get somebody in a paid position. So one of the chapters in our book, written by my colleague Mel Ball, is about co-production, and really it's a really great chapter when she just writes, you know, you absolutely have to not just involve people, you have to co-produce the work that you do with people who've used your services. And so we're really, really keen to do that, and to co-produce the work that we do with somebody who's got lived experience of criminal justice settings. That would be fantastic.
But Jo, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been absolutely fascinating to listen to the power threat meaning framework, and I've read about it and I've started implementing it in practice, but actually I think how you've approached it and the way in which you approach it has given me a lot of food for thought, actually, about looking at it more from an organisational point of view. So it's been absolutely fascinating. We're really grateful for your time. And there's just one thing left to say: let's talk forensic psychology.